Hi, I am Muhammad Ismail MT, Assistant Professor, Department of English. Welcome to E-Content Development Center, Majlis Arts and Science College, Puramannur. In this video, I would like to discuss the historical background and social context of postmodernism. After this video, you will be able to interpret the postmodernist theory very easily. Most of the students of literature and the social science, they consider that the theories are very difficult thing to understand and literary theories are very incomprehensible. There are so many reasons for the difficulty of understanding literary theories. There are many reasons are there, like we know that the intellectuals are coming from the French intellectual traditions. But I think that if you know the enough information about the historical background and the social context of each and every theory, you will be able to understand it so easily. That is why in this video, I am going to discuss the historical context and social background of the postmodernism. We know that postmodernism is a general and wide-ranging term that is applied to literature, arts, architecture, philosophy, and etc. We know that postmodernism is a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, relativism, and postmodernism stands against the objective reality that science advocates. You should understand that postmodernism is not a historical event or it is not a philosophy. It is a mode of a particular period of time, especially after 1950s, especially after Second World War. By 1950s, there is a crisis in sensibility in understanding the world around the people. We know that each and every movement arises as a reaction against the existed ideas, like we know that Romanticism arises as a reaction to the Age of Enlightenment and the industrialization. Like this, postmodernism has also originated as a reaction to the modernism and modernization. So we know that postmodernism, in that term there are two words are there, postmodernism, that means that after modernism. And we can say that postmodernism is a set of ideas or the prevalent mood after 1950s, that means after modernism. So if you want to understand what is postmodernism in clear detail, you need to understand the flashback of 20th century. That is the background, that is the historical background and the social context of postmodernism. As I said earlier that if you want to understand postmodernism clearly, you need to have enough information about the background of 20th century. What are the major incidents, what are the key ideas that changed the course of 20th century thought. And we know that 20th century, as we already said, 20th century is an age of modernization. We know that with the help of science and with the technological advancement, their human beings conquered the time and space. So we know that the 20th century, first half of the 20th century witnessed a lot of drastic changes socially, culturally. And we know that modernism at that period, it is a climax of the Renaissance period and Enlightenment period. We know that Renaissance period and Enlightenment period, there gave human beings a set of promises like liberal humanism, new world, democracy and equality and idea of development and progression and idea of scientific temperament. That means that since the 15th century, since the inception of the Renaissance thinking and enlightenment and through the climax of modernism, human beings began to believe in a certain set of ideas like an idea of progression, as we have discussed later, liberal humanism, equality. But you know that first half of the 20th century witnessed a set of ideas and a lot of incidents that changed. We know that some set of ideas and some catastrophic incidents changed the perception of human mind and human life. That leads to the postmodern thoughts. Firstly, I would like to mention a major philosopher named as Friedrich Nietzsche. in his collection of the book, The Gay Science, that he announced to the world that the God is dead. You know that as a result of the Enlightenment thinking, reason and rationality, and we know that in 1859, Charles Darwin published his book, Origin of Species. From that period onwards, there we can witness a kind of steady decline in religious belief and belief in God. At that juncture, Friedrich Nietzsche announced that the God is dead. From that statement onwards, there is a movement, it is known as nihilism, that everything is senselessness, everything is meaningless. So these kinds of ideas lead the people into a kind of frustration, a kind of senselessness and rootlessness in religion. So human beings began to lose their belief in religion and God. So these ideas of nihilism later developed into the existential nihilism that happened in 1950s and 1960s. The next major figure I would like to mention, that is Sigmund Freud. He published his book Interpretation of Dreams. So he started a new idea of psychoanalysis. Until then, human beings believed that the conscious mind is the human being. But it is not the real, and Sigmund Freud redefined the human nature. He says that subconscious mind is very important, that controls the human behavior, that controls the human nature. That is why that treatment, that importance of subconscious, that later developed into a theory, the theory of psychoanalysis. And so many writers like D.H. Lawrence, Thomas Mann and Marcel Proust, and so many theoreticians like Lacan and Althusser and Gramsci, they used these theories of psychoanalysis. And those were the prominent ideas of after 1960s. Another important theoretician, that is Ferdinand D. And we know that in 1916, his student, the student of Ferdinand D. they collected the lecture notes of that teacher and they published a book in 1916, Cause de Linguistics. That is generally known as linguistic turn. And he tried to redefine the nature of the world. It is the language that constitutes the world. He developed a theory, a study field of semiotics. Later his theories used the structuralist philosopher and post-structuralist philosopher in order to define the nature of knowledge and knowledge production and interpretation of meaning. So his theories developed into the discussion of knowledge production. So the nature of knowledge and nature of culture, that were the favorite subject of the postmodernist thinking. So I would like to invite your attention, after we discuss the major philosophers, major thinkers of that period that changed the course of 20th century thought pattern, I would like to invite your attention some catastrophic and some important major incidents in the first half of the 20th century. Firstly, I would like to mention about Russian Revolution that took place in 1917, their emergence of socialism. As a reaction to the capitalism and imperialist powers, there emerged a new form of government, that is an emergence of socialism as a powerful opponent of capitalism. Human beings, they got a new hope in socialism that it will rescue them from their suffering and from their miseries. But you know that by the 1950s and 1960s, the scenario was completely changed. Human beings began to lose their faith in socialism because of the Stalinism and Gulag and concentration camp like the conducted by the Gulag. A lot of people were brutally murdered and killed by the Stalinist government. So subsequently what happened? The human beings began to lose their faith in socialism. And second major incident, it is very important that two World War First and World War Second. By the World War Second, the human beings completely lost their faith in new order. And you know that there happened because of the two world war, there were lot of political turmoils and social instabilities, and they lost their belief in a new order. And we know that in Second World War, America detonated what? The atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima with the help of science. What happened? Within seconds, they wiped out the millions of people in a city. And you know that usage of atomic bomb, that the powers used the science as a tool of destruction. Consequently, what happened? Human beings lost the belief in religion, socialism, capitalism, and science also. In 20th century, another major incident that changed the perception of human nature, that is Hitler and his policies. In 1923 in Germany, Hitler became the ruler. But by the 1930s and 1940s, what happened? The millions of Jews were exterminated, were killed in concentration camp. So these kinds of thoughts that lead the people that it was a shocking experience to the ideas of humanism and the ideas of modern man. We know that Renaissance period and Enlightenment ideas advocating the liberal humanistic ideas. They were discussing about equality, they were discussing about fraternity, but due to the tragic and catastrophic intervention of Hitler, the lot of people were killed by the cruelties of Hitler, and it was a shock to the liberal humanistic ideas of human being. And another incident, I would like to invite your attention to the 1929, there happened the great economic crash known as the Great Wall Street Crash. So it showed the world the capitalism and its flaws. Human beings also lost their belief in the capitalism also. What was the result? The high rate of unemployment and the utter poverty. Human beings lost their attachment with the capitalism also. Another major historical incident, that is known as decolonization. You know that by 1950s and 1940s, so many third world countries got liberation from the British Empire. So that had a historical experience known as decolonization that opened a kind of new treatment of human experience, and the new republics and new countries were formed to discuss those issues, the issues of a post-colonial identity. Later it developed into, at the period of post-modernism, later these kinds of ideas later developed into an academic discipline known as post-colonialism. Like this, there are number of incidents and number of ideas that changed the course of 20th century thoughts and 20th century human life. As we discussed earlier, we know that 20th century is an age of development, age of progression. In order to point out these development, another French philosopher named as Paul Virilio, he listed the 3 milestones of 20th century in order to show what are those developments that changed the history of 20th century. The first one is that Paul Virilio showed the 3 milestones of 20th century. First one is transportation revolution. In 20th century, with the help of science and technology, human beings invented road, rails, cable, and these kinds of things changed the transportation capacities of human life, and it changed the human understanding of the world. And as I discussed earlier, that with the help of science, human beings conquered the time and space. So with the development of transportation revolution, human beings changed their concept of time and space. Second very important one is second revolution, that is known as transmission revolution. That happened that changed the concept of communication of the human mind, like radio, TV and internet. Later in the postmodernist ideas or the post-truth ideas, later these revolution changed the human reality into the virtual reality and augmented reality. So the third one is the transplantation revolution. That is in a medical science sense, that is a transplantation revolution. That means that there happened a lot of innovation took place in microtechnology and biotechnology, cloning and genomes, and they redefined the concept of life and creation. So these kinds of incidents, these kinds of development, these kinds of ideas lead the people into the new realm of reality. The concept of reality was completely changed. It is not the objective reality as the science advocates. It is not the subjective reality. It is a new realm of reality that happened because of these kinds of incidents. But because of these changes and progression, already in 1922, a philosopher like Max Weber pointed out such a kinds of the unmagicking of disenchantment. That means there is a kind of disillusionment because of these development and incidents. And we know that in 1962, Rachel Carson, in her book Silent Spring, she pointed out the toxic nature of progress. Progress is very good for human being. Okay, I am ready to accept that, but you need to think about the toxic nature of progress. There are a lot of number of demerits of this progression. So these kinds of things pointed out. There are so many thinkers like Max Weber and Rachel Carson, and we know that as feminism, we know that in 1960s onwards, there are a lot of movements against the established authorities, resentment against traditional and conventional authorities and power agencies. Feminism arises as a resentment against the patriarchal authorities. Like this, 1960s onwards, there is a series of revolt against the established and conventional authority as a power agencies. These kinds of number of incidents changed the perception of new hopes, perception of the human mind. These kinds of socio-political and economical issues lead the people into a number of frustration. Their confidence was completely broken. They became senselessness. They became introvert. The writers selected the subject rather than the collective subject. They selected the individual self. They changed their attention. They changed their focus into the individual self. So, because of the confidence was completely broken, the human beings became the senselessness, rootlessness because of the war, because of the development. Human beings began to think that something wrong with everything, something wrong with everything. So because they lost their belief in socialism, because socialism was also using the hydrogen bomb. Where the capitalism used the atomic bomb, the socialism used the hydrogen bomb. Where Hitler used the concentration camp in order to kill the Jew people, the Stalin used the gulag to exterminate the innocent people in the concentration. So they lost their belief in socialism, in religion, in science, and so as a result of these series of incidents, human beings they became completely disillusioned. They became nihilistic. They felt no values between the relationship. There is no community life and there is no familial life, only concentrating on the individual self. That is the important postmodern characteristic. And after 1950s and 1960s, intellectuals began to interpret these change, these new tendencies and new disruptions and revolt. Postmodernism arose as a sentiment against contemporary values and crises. So, I would like to conclude by saying that these kinds of changed world interpreted by the intellectual, that interpretation, that set of ideas later known as the postmodern thoughts. It is not a video about what is postmodernism, what are the postmodern theories. I am just giving you some snapshots of the postmodern intellectuals and their thoughts. Firstly, I would like to mention the French philosopher Yin Francis Leotard. He says, he analyzed the nature of truth. What is truth? He asked a very important question to the postmodern audience, that what is truth? He analyzed the nature of truth and he published his book in 1979 that is titled as Postmodern Condition. And after he analyzed the nature of truth, he says that truth is neither absolute and nor self-contained. Until then, according to the European tradition, whatever anything proved by reason and logic are considered as an absolute truth. until then the human beings, that what is absolute truth? Anything proved by reason and logic, that is considered as absolute truth. Leotard says it is not true, because there is no such thing. There is no absolute truth. There is no truth is related to many things. Leotard rejected that idea of absolute truth by describing meta-narratives. Another postmodern intellectual I would like to focus on, Jean Baudrillard. He was also another French thinker. He says about the theory of simulation, and after he analyzed the nature of reality, what is reality? Leotard was discussing about nature of truth, and Baudrillard was discussing about the nature of reality, what is the reality. And he says that reality is a complicated thing, because nowadays the reality is constructed by electronic media. We live in post-truth world. We know that we get some kind of reality. It is created by the social and electronic media. That is a theory of simulation and simulacra. Those ideas are very relevant. You need to do a research on the theories of Jean Baudrillard. The next postmodern philosopher I need to focus on, Roland Barthes. He published his essay Death of the Author in 1968. And we know that in 1960s onwards, as we discussed earlier, that 1960s onwards, there happened a resentment and a revolt against the conventional authorities. And Roland Barthes asked who interpret the meaning. He raised a new question, the question of interpretation. Who controls the meaning? Who created the meaning of a text? So Roland Barthes says that reader was given the supreme freedom to interpret the text, not the author. So author is dead. Death of the author. Roland Barthes tried to give the supreme power to the reader to describe, to interpret the meaning of a text. These ideas leads to these ideas lead to post-structuralism. Okay. Another postmodernist thinker I would like to mention about Michel Foucault, and he analyzed the nature of knowledge. What is knowledge? And he says that knowledge is a cultural construction. And you know that what is a culture? Culture is, you know, that power control, power agencies like religion, like authority and government, they control the knowledge construction. So whatever the knowledge we get, that is controlled by some agencies. So we need to question the absoluteness and absoluteness of knowledge. Michel Foucault says so. So after Michel Foucault analyzed the nature of knowledge, he says that there are some kinds of power agencies that controls the knowledge production. Another postmodern thinker, that is Antonio Gramsci, he discussed about theory of culture, what is culture, and there is a tendency that less developed one will be dominated by more developed one in every species, in every culture. We know that white people controls the black people, and European controls the Asiatic world, and men and patriarchal men controls the women. That is, less developed one will be dominated by more developed ones in that sense. So these are the groundbreaking ideas advocated by Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, Antonio Gramsci, Leotard and Baudrillard. And there are so many theories are like this: Derrida's deconstruction and feministic theory, psychoanalytic theory and ecofeministic theory, eco-critic theories. There are a lot of theories in order to describe the postmodern conditions of the world. Let me conclude this video by giving you a suitable quotation to describe what postmodernism. And postmodernism was a reaction to modernism. As we discussed earlier, that postmodernism was a reaction to modernism, where modernism was about objectivity. Postmodernism was about subjectivity. Modernism was about objectivity and postmodernism was about subjectivity, where modernism sought a singular truth. Postmodernism sought the multiplicity of truth. that truth is a relative thing that leads to the discussion of the relativism. We discussed the historical background and cultural and socio-cultural context of the postmodernism, and these are the things that lead the people, lead the intellectual to define the postmodern condition. Next video we will discuss about the postmodern intellectuals in detail. Until then, thank you very much.